Hello, dear Sleepyheads. Tonight, we drift back to the golden sands of Egypt, to the twilight of an empire, and to the final breath of its ancient royalty. This is the story of a queen who defied the world with intelligence, grace, and determination, a woman whose name echoes through time. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you. If these quiet journeys bring you peace, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me create more stories like this. Now, close your eyes and let us step quietly into the world of Cleopatra, the last Queen of Egypt. In the gentle glow of Alexandria's great library, where countless scrolls held the wisdom of ages, a young princess named Cleopatra, the seventh Philoppator, first learned to read the ancient hieroglyphs that adorned her ancestors' monuments. The year was 51 BCE, and the Mediterranean world stretched before her like an endless tapestry of possibility and peril. Alexandria, in those days, was a marvel that seemed to float between earth and sky. The city's white marble buildings caught the golden light of dawn and held it throughout the day, their surfaces warming under the Egyptian sun. The famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the world, stood sentinel over the harbor, its beacon guiding ships from distant lands toward the safety of the royal port. From the palace windows, young Cleopatra could watch the vessels arrive each morning, their holds filled with spices from India, silk from the far reaches of Asia, and grain from the fertile valleys of the Nile. The Ptolemaic palace itself was a wonder of gardens and courtyards, where fountains bubbled softly among groves of date palms and fig trees. Peacocks wandered the manicured paths, their cries mixing with the distant sound of waves against the harbor's stone walls. Here, in this sanctuary of learning and luxury, Cleopatra spent her childhood absorbing the complexities of ruling an ancient kingdom in a changing world. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy V, who had claimed Egypt as his prize when the great conqueror's empire was divided. For nearly 3 centuries, her family had ruled Egypt, maintaining the old traditions while adapting to the realities of Mediterranean politics. They were Greek by heritage, but Egyptian by adoption. Pharaohs who wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt while conducting diplomacy in the language of Homer and Plato. Cleopatra's education began early, as was the custom for Ptolemaic royalty. Her tutors were scholars from the great library, men who had spent their lives studying mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. They taught her to speak Greek with the refined accent of the royal court, but also encouraged her unusual interest in the Egyptian language, something few of her Ptolemaic predecessors had bothered to learn. This would prove to be one of her greatest assets in the years to come. The princess showed an remarkable aptitude for languages. By the age of 12, she could converse fluently in Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and the languages of the Ethiopian kingdoms to the south. Her memory was extraordinary. She could recite entire passages from Homer's epics and discuss the finer points of Aristotelian logic with her philosophy tutors. Mathematics came naturally to her, as did the study of astronomy, which was considered essential knowledge for any ruler of Egypt, where the annual flooding of the Nile was predicted by careful observation of the stars. But it was in the art of statecraft that young Cleopatra truly excelled. Her father, Ptolemy XII, recognized her potential early and began including her in meetings with foreign ambassadors and Egyptian officials. She learned to listen carefully, to observe the subtle interplay of power and personality that shaped every political negotiation. She discovered that knowledge was indeed power, but that the skillful application of charm and intelligence could be more effective than any army. The Egypt of Cleopatra's youth was a land of contrasts that would have enchanted any traveler fortunate enough to visit. Along the Nile's banks, farmers followed the same agricultural rhythms their ancestors had observed for 3,000 years. When the river's annual flood receded, leaving behind rich, dark soil, they planted their crops of wheat and barley. The harvest months brought festivals of thanksgiving to the gods, and the granaries filled with grain that would feed not only Egypt, but much of the Mediterranean world. In the cities, particularly Alexandria, a different Egypt flourished. Here, Greek culture mingled with Egyptian tradition, Roman influence, and ideas from across the known world. The great library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, making it the greatest repository of human knowledge in existence. Scholars came from every corner of the Mediterranean to study there, and the city hummed with intellectual activity. Mathematicians made discoveries that would influence human thought for centuries. Astronomers mapped the movements of celestial bodies with unprecedented accuracy. Physicians advanced the understanding of human anatomy and disease. Yet beneath this glittering surface, political pressures were building that would soon reshape the entire region. Rome's power was growing steadily, and the independent kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean found themselves increasingly drawn into the Roman sphere of influence. Egypt's wealth made it particularly attractive to Roman eyes. The kingdom's grain fed Rome's growing population, and its gold helped finance Roman military campaigns. Egyptian merchants traded throughout the Mediterranean, bringing wealth and exotic goods to Alexandria's markets. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had learned to navigate these dangerous waters through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. He maintained Egypt's independence by cultivating friendships among Rome's leading politicians, sometimes paying substantial bribes to ensure their support. This policy had kept Egypt free, but it had also made the kingdom dependent on Roman goodwill. The young princess watched and learned as her father balanced these competing demands, understanding that Egypt's future would require even more skillful diplomacy. The palace where Cleopatra spent her formative years was itself a testament to this cultural fusion. Egyptian art adorned the walls, showing the gods and goddesses who had protected the land for millennia. Greek sculptures filled the courtyards, celebrating the beauty of human form and the achievements of legendary heroes. Roman mosaics decorated the floors of the newer buildings, their intricate patterns telling stories of distant lands and mythical creatures. The princess walked through this living museum daily, absorbing lessons about the interconnectedness of cultures and the importance of understanding diverse traditions. Her tutors encouraged her to think beyond the traditional boundaries of Egyptian politics. They taught her a Roman history, helping her understand the republican traditions that governed Rome's internal affairs and the military virtues that had built its empire. They introduced her to Greek philosophy, particularly the Stoic teachings that emphasized duty, self-control, and rational decision-making. They shared the wisdom of Egyptian priests who had preserved ancient knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics through centuries of foreign rule. As Cleopatra approached her 18th birthday, she had become something unique in the ancient world, a ruler educated in multiple traditions, fluent in numerous languages, and trained in both the practical arts of governance and the theoretical foundations of leadership. Her intelligence was matched by her charm, her learning balanced by her understanding of human nature. She had inherited her father's political acumen, but possessed a charisma and intellectual curiosity that would prove far more powerful than any of her Ptolemaic ancestors had enjoyed. The princess also understood that her position as a woman in the ancient world presented both challenges and opportunities. While most societies of her time limited women's political participation, Egypt had a long tradition of powerful queens. Hatshepsut had ruled as pharaoh more than 1,000 years earlier, and several Ptolemaic women had wielded significant influence. Cleopatra studied these precedents carefully, learning how feminine intelligence could be deployed most effectively in a world dominated by masculine power. In quiet moments, when the day's lessons were finished and the palace settled into evening calm, Cleopatra would often walk in the royal gardens or along the harbor's edge. The Mediterranean's gentle waves would whisper against the stone piers, and the lighthouse's beam would sweep across the water, illuminating ships returning from distant voyages. During these solitary times, she must have contemplated the responsibilities that would soon fall to her and the challenges that lay ahead. The princess could not have known that she was living through the final years of the old order, that the Roman Republic was beginning its transformation into an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries to come. She could not have foreseen that her own life would become intertwined with some of history's most famous figures, or that her story would be told and retold for over 2,000 years. But perhaps, in those quiet evening moments, she sensed that extraordinary times were approaching, and that her careful education would soon be tested in ways her tutors had never imagined. As 51 BCE drew to a close and the time approached for her to assume the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra VII stood ready to begin one of history's most fascinating reigns. She was 18 years old, brilliant, beautiful, and ambitious. The ancient kingdom of the pharaohs was about to gain a ruler who would prove worthy of its magnificent heritage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Temple of Ptah in Memphis when Cleopatra VII first placed the double crown of Egypt upon her head. It was 51 BCE, and the ancient ceremony that had been performed for pharaohs for over 3 millennia took on new significance as the young queen prepared to rule a kingdom balanced precariously between independence and absorption into the Roman world. The coronation itself was a masterpiece of carefully orchestrated tradition. Egyptian priests, their heads shaved and their white linen robes pristine in the morning light, performed rituals that connected the new pharaoh to gods whose worship stretched back to the dawn of civilization. They anointed her with sacred oils, spoke the ancient words that made her the living embodiment of Isis on earth, and presented her with the crook and flail that symbolized her divine authority over the land of the Nile. Yet even as these timeless ceremonies unfolded, everyone present understood that this pharaoh would face challenges unlike any of her predecessors. Rome's shadow fell across every aspect of Egyptian governance, and the new queen's ability to navigate Roman politics would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of her kingdom as an independent nation. Cleopatra shared the throne with her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII, following the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling co-rule. This arrangement, while sanctioned by centuries of precedent, created immediate complications. The boy king was guided by advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, who believed that Egypt's future lay in complete accommodation to Roman wishes. They viewed the young queen's more independent approach with suspicion and concern. The political situation that greeted the new co-rulers was extraordinarily complex. Egypt remained nominally independent, but Roman influence permeated every aspect of the kingdom's external relations. Roman merchants controlled much of Alexandria's commerce. Roman creditors held substantial Egyptian debts incurred during the previous reign. Roman politicians expected regular tribute and support for their various military campaigns throughout the Mediterranean. Within Egypt itself, the population was divided into several distinct groups, each with its own interests and loyalties. The Greek-speaking urban elite, concentrated in Alexandria and other major cities, had prospered under Ptolemaic rule and generally supported policies that maintained their privileged position. The native Egyptian population, which formed the majority of the kingdom's inhabitants, had preserved their ancient customs and religion despite 3 centuries of foreign rule. They looked to their pharaoh to protect traditional ways and to govern with the wisdom of the old gods. Cleopatra approached these challenges with the intellectual tools her education had provided. She understood that effective rule required more than just the exercise of royal authority. It demanded a careful balancing of competing interests, a deep understanding of human psychology, and the ability to inspire loyalty across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Her fluency in Egyptian, which set her apart from most of her Ptolemaic predecessors, allowed her to communicate directly with the kingdom's native population and to demonstrate her respect for their traditions. The Queen's first major test came when civil unrest erupted in the Thebaid, the region around ancient Thebes in Upper Egypt. Local officials had imposed new taxes to meet Roman financial demands, and the population had responded with protests that quickly escalated into open rebellion. Traditional pharaonic policy would have been to send troops to suppress the uprising through force, but Cleopatra chose a different approach. Instead of immediately deploying the royal army, she traveled south to investigate the situation personally. This decision surprised many of her advisors, who considered it beneath the dignity of a pharaoh to involve herself directly in provincial affairs. But Cleopatra understood that the unrest reflected deeper grievances that could not be resolved through military action alone. Her journey up the Nile became a masterclass in political theatre and practical diplomacy. She traveled in the royal barge, a vessel of extraordinary beauty whose golden decorations caught the sunlight and whose purple sails announced the presence of Pharaoh to every village along the river's banks. At each stop, she held audiences with local officials and common citizens alike, listening to their concerns and demonstrating her commitment to understanding their problems. The Queen's ability to speak Egyptian proved invaluable during these encounters. When she addressed crowds in their own language, using the formal phrases and traditional expressions that showed her respect for their culture, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Many of these people had never seen a pharaoh in person, and certainly had never heard one speak to them in their own tongue. The effect was transformative. Rather than simply imposing royal will, Cleopatra negotiated. She adjusted tax rates to more reasonable levels, replaced corrupt local officials with administrators chosen for their competence and integrity, and established new procedures for addressing citizen grievances. She also made highly visible offerings to the traditional Egyptian gods, demonstrating her commitment to the religious practices that remained central to most of her subjects' lives. The success of this approach was remarkable. The uprising dissolved without significant bloodshed, and the regions that had been on the verge of open rebellion became some of the most loyal parts of her kingdom. Word of the young queen's wisdom and accessibility spread throughout Egypt, creating a foundation of popular support that would prove crucial in the challenges ahead. However, her brother's advisors viewed Cleopatra's independent initiatives with growing alarm. Pothinus, in particular, began to argue that the queen's policies were dangerously provocative to Rome. He pointed out that her direct engagement with Egyptian commoners could be interpreted as encouraging nationalism and resistance to foreign influence. He suggested that her modifications to tax policy undermined agreements made with Roman creditors. These tensions came to a head during discussions about Egypt's response to the growing civil war in Rome itself. Julius Caesar and Pompey, two of Rome's most powerful leaders, were moving toward a confrontation that would determine the future of the Roman Republic. Both men had supporters and agents in Alexandria. Both had provided assistance to Egypt in the past, and both now expected Egyptian support for their cause. Ptolemy XIII's advisors favored backing Pompey, who had previously helped restore Ptolemy XII to his throne, and who seemed to represent the more traditional elements of Roman society. They argued that supporting Pompey would demonstrate Egypt's reliability as a Roman ally, and would position the kingdom favorably when the civil war ended. Cleopatra was more cautious. Her analysis of the situation suggested that Caesar was more likely to emerge victorious, despite Pompey's apparent advantages. She had studied Caesar's military campaigns in Gaul and his political maneuvering in Rome, and she believed that his combination of strategic brilliance and popular support made him a formidable opponent. More importantly, she recognized that Caesar's more flexible approach to governance might offer Egypt better opportunities to maintain its independence. The disagreement over Roman policy became a proxy for deeper conflicts about the direction of Egyptian governance. The Queen's approach emphasized Egypt's unique position and the importance of maintaining the kingdom's distinctive character while adapting to Mediterranean realities. Her brother's advisors preferred a more submissive stance that would minimize the risk of Roman displeasure by anticipating and accommodating Roman wishes. As 49 BCE progressed and the Roman civil war intensified, these internal Egyptian tensions reached a crisis point. Pothinus and Achillas began to question whether the kingdom could afford to have its foreign policy directed by a young woman whose independence of mind might prove dangerous to Egypt's survival. They started to explore the possibility of ruling through Ptolemy XIII alone, reducing Cleopatra to a ceremonial role, or removing her from power entirely. The Queen was not oblivious to these developments. Her network of informants within the palace and throughout the kingdom kept her well informed about the plots forming against her. She understood that her position was becoming increasingly precarious, and that decisive action might soon be necessary to preserve both her throne and her vision for Egypt's future. During the quiet hours of early morning, when Alexandria's streets were empty except for the occasional merchant preparing for the day's business, Cleopatra would often walk through the palace gardens, contemplating the choices before her. The scent of jasmine and roses filled the air, and the gentle sound of fountains provided a peaceful counterpoint to the political turmoil surrounding her. She thought about the lessons of history, particularly the examples of previous pharaohs who had faced similar challenges. She remembered the stories of Queen Hatshepsut, who had maintained her throne for 22 years, despite opposition from traditional court factions. She recalled the diplomatic triumphs of earlier Ptolemies, who had preserved Egypt's independence through skillful negotiation and strategic alliance building. Most importantly, she reflected on her responsibilities to the Egyptian people, whose lives would be directly affected by the political decisions made in Alexandria's royal palace. The farmers along the Nile, the craftsmen in Memphis, the merchants in the Delta cities all depended on their pharaoh to protect their interests and preserve the stability that allowed their communities to prosper. As the conflict with her brother's advisors intensified, Cleopatra began to prepare for the possibility that she might need to leave Alexandria and build support elsewhere in Egypt. She quietly strengthened her relationships with loyal military commanders and provincial governors. She increased her contacts with Egyptian priests and local leaders who had been favorably impressed by her earlier travels through the kingdom. The young queen also began to consider the international dimensions of her situation more carefully. If civil war broke out in Egypt, she might need foreign allies to help her regain her throne. This possibility led her to think more seriously about the Roman situation and the potential advantages of establishing a direct relationship with whichever Roman leader emerged victorious. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only Cleopatra's personal fate, but the future of one of the ancient world's most storied kingdoms. The last pharaoh of Egypt was about to face her greatest test, and the decisions she made in the coming months would echo through history for centuries to come. The Mediterranean waves lapped gently against the hull of the small fishing vessel as it approached Alexandria's harbour in the autumn of 48 BCE. Hidden within the boat's modest cargo hold, wrapped in fine linen and protected by a loyal servant's care, lay one of history's most audacious gambits. Cleopatra VII, the exiled Queen of Egypt, was about to make her return to power in a manner that would become the stuff of legend. The months leading to this moment had been filled with uncertainty and careful planning. Driven from Alexandria by her brother's supporters, Cleopatra had retreated to the Egyptian countryside, where she had spent the better part of a year building an army and cultivating the loyalty of officials who remained faithful to her cause. But military force alone would not be sufficient to reclaim her throne. The arrival of Julius Caesar in Alexandria had created a new set of possibilities and dangers that required a more subtle approach. Caesar had come to Egypt in pursuit of his defeated rival Pompey, only to discover that Ptolemy XIII's advisors had murdered the Roman general in a misguided attempt to curry favor with the victor of the civil war. The great Roman leader had been appalled by this treachery, and his reaction had made clear that Egypt's future relationship with Rome would depend on how skillfully the kingdom's leaders could navigate the complex currents of Roman politics and personal honor. From her place of exile, Cleopatra had watched these developments with the keen eye of a strategist trained in the subtleties of international diplomacy. She recognized that Caesar's presence in Alexandria represented both an opportunity and a crisis. If she could win his support, she might regain her throne and establish Egypt as a valued ally of Rome's most powerful leader. If she failed, her kingdom might be absorbed directly into the Roman Empire, ending 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The plan she devised was characteristically bold. Rather than requesting a formal audience or attempting to negotiate through intermediaries, she would present herself directly to Caesar in a manner that would demonstrate her intelligence, courage, and flair for dramatic gestures. The famous story of her arrival, concealed within a carpet or linen wrapping, captures the essence of her approach: unexpected, memorable, and designed to bypass the conventional protocols that her enemies controlled. On that fateful evening, as Caesar conducted business in the royal palace that had been her childhood home, Cleopatra's servant carried his precious burden through the building's corridors and into the Roman general's presence. When the wrappings were unrolled to reveal the young queen, the effect was exactly what she had intended. Caesar, a man who prided himself on being prepared for any eventuality, found himself genuinely surprised by both the audacity of her entrance and the presence of the woman who emerged. The meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar has been embellished by centuries of romantic legend, but the historical reality was probably more complex and interesting than the simplified versions that have come down to us. The young queen, 21 years old and fighting for her kingdom's survival, met with the 52-year-old Roman general who had just emerged victorious from a civil war that had torn the Republic apart. Both were intelligent, ambitious, and acutely aware of the political calculations that shaped their world. Their initial conversations took place in Greek, the language of educated discourse throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra's fluency and sophistication impressed Caesar, who had expected to encounter a typical Hellenistic monarch concerned primarily with pleasure and ceremony. Instead, he found a ruler who could discuss philosophy, mathematics, and military strategy with equal facility. Her knowledge of Roman history and politics was particularly impressive, demonstrating that she had prepared for this encounter with characteristic thoroughness. Caesar was also struck by her understanding of Egypt's unique position in the Mediterranean world. Unlike many of the kings and queens he had encountered, Cleopatra genuinely cared about her subjects' welfare and had given serious thought to policies that would promote Egypt's prosperity while maintaining its independence. She spoke eloquently about the kingdom's agricultural wealth, its commercial networks, and its cultural achievements, painting a vision of Egypt as a partner rather than a mere client state. The political arrangement they negotiated reflected this mutual respect and shared interest in Egypt's stability. Caesar agreed to support Cleopatra's restoration to the throne, using his military resources to overcome the opposition of Ptolemy XIII's supporters. In return, the queen committed Egypt to providing financial and logistical support for Caesar's ongoing political and military campaigns. This was not a one-sided arrangement imposed by Roman force, but a genuine alliance between two leaders who recognized their complementary strengths. The campaign to restore Cleopatra to power was brief but decisive. Caesar's veteran legions, experienced in the complex urban warfare that had characterized the Roman Civil War, proved more than a match for the forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII. The key battle took place in Alexandria itself, where fighting raged through the city's streets and squares before culminating in the famous fire that damaged part of the Great Library. The destruction of those irreplaceable scrolls remains one of history's great cultural tragedies, though the library continued to function for several more centuries. During the fighting, young Ptolemy XIII died, ending the civil war within Egypt's royal family. Cleopatra was restored as pharaoh, initially ruling alongside her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, in accordance with Ptolemaic tradition. However, it was clear to all observers that the queen was now the kingdom's undisputed leader, with the intelligence and political connections necessary to guide Egypt through the dangerous currents of Mediterranean politics. The personal relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar evolved alongside their political alliance. The Roman general, a man known for his numerous romantic entanglements, was genuinely captivated by the Egyptian queen's combination of beauty, intelligence, and political acumen. She represented something unique in his experience, a woman who was his intellectual equal and who ruled a kingdom in her own right. For Cleopatra, the relationship served multiple purposes beyond any personal attraction she may have felt. Alliance with Caesar provided the protection Egypt needed to maintain its independence. Association with Rome's most powerful leader enhanced her status among her own subjects and foreign rulers. The connection also offered opportunities to influence Roman policy in ways that would benefit Egypt's long-term interests. Their famous journey up the Nile in 47 BCE symbolized both the personal and political dimensions of their alliance. The royal barge, a floating palace decorated with gold and precious stones, carried them through the heart of Egypt while demonstrating to the population that their queen had secured the support of Rome's greatest general. The trip allowed Caesar to see Egypt's agricultural wealth firsthand and to understand why the kingdom was so valuable to Roman interests. The birth of their son Caesarion in 47 BCE added another dimension to their relationship. While Caesar never formally acknowledged the child as his heir, the boy's existence created a potential dynastic link between Egypt and Rome that would influence politics for years to come. For Cleopatra, motherhood enhanced her status among her Egyptian subjects, who valued fertility and family continuity in their rulers. Caesar's extended stay in Egypt, lasting several months, was unusual for a Roman general with significant military and political responsibilities elsewhere. His willingness to remain in Alexandria demonstrated the importance he placed on the Egyptian alliance and his recognition of Cleopatra's value as a partner. During this time, they worked together to implement reforms that would strengthen Egypt's administration and increase its prosperity. The queen used Caesar's presence to consolidate her authority throughout the kingdom. Provincial governors and local officials who had opposed her during the civil war now hastened to demonstrate their loyalty. The Egyptian priesthood, always sensitive to political changes, celebrated the restoration of stability and the pharaoh's obvious divine favor as demonstrated by her powerful foreign ally. When Caesar finally departed Egypt in 47 BCE to address military challenges elsewhere in his expanding sphere of influence, he left behind a kingdom that was more stable and prosperous than it had been in decades. Cleopatra had achieved her primary objectives. She had regained her throne, secured Egypt's independence, and established herself as a significant player in Mediterranean politics. The alliance with Caesar also provided Egypt with breathing space to address internal challenges that had accumulated during the period of civil strife. The Queen implemented agricultural reforms that increased crop yields and improved the lives of farming communities along the Nile. She invested in infrastructure projects that enhanced trade and communication throughout the kingdom. She supported cultural and educational institutions that maintained Egypt's reputation as a center of learning and artistic achievement. Most importantly, the success of her bold gamble in approaching Caesar had established Cleopatra's reputation as a leader of exceptional ability and determination. Throughout the Mediterranean world, rulers and politicians now recognized that the young Queen of Egypt possessed the intelligence, courage, and diplomatic skill necessary to protect her kingdom's interests in an increasingly dangerous world. As 46 BCE began, Cleopatra could look back on a remarkable transformation in her circumstances. From an exiled queen fighting for survival, she had become the ruler of a stable and prosperous kingdom allied with Rome's most powerful leader. The challenges ahead would prove even greater than those she had already overcome. But her success in forging the alliance with Caesar had demonstrated that she possessed the qualities necessary to meet whatever tests history might provide. The morning sun cast its warm golden light across the terraced gardens of the royal palace in Alexandria as Cleopatra walked among the flowering oleanders and date palms, her young son Caesarion playing beside the marble fountains. It was 45 BCE, and Egypt was experiencing a period of unprecedented prosperity and stability under her rule. The kingdom that had been torn by civil war just a few years earlier had been transformed into one of the Mediterranean's most successful states. The restoration of internal peace had allowed Cleopatra to focus on the administrative and economic reforms that would become hallmarks of her reign. Drawing upon her extensive education and her understanding of both Egyptian and Mediterranean traditions, she implemented policies that strengthened the kingdom's foundations while positioning it to thrive in the changing political landscape of the Roman world. Agriculture remained the cornerstone of Egypt's economy, and the Queen devoted considerable attention to improving the productivity of the Nile Valley. She ordered the construction of new irrigation channels that brought water to previously uncultivated areas, expanding the kingdom's agricultural base. She established royal granaries in strategic locations throughout the country, ensuring that surplus grain from good harvest years could be stored to provide security during times of scarcity. The annual Nile flood, which had been the foundation of Egyptian civilization for millennia, continued to provide the rich soil that made the kingdom the Mediterranean's breadbasket. But under Cleopatra's guidance, Egyptian agriculture became more sophisticated and productive than ever before. New crops were introduced from other parts of the world, diversifying the kingdom's agricultural output and reducing its dependence on grain production alone. The Queen also invested heavily in Egypt's manufacturing capabilities. Alexandria's workshops produced luxury goods that were prized throughout the Roman world. Fine textiles, jewelry, glassware, and perfumes that commanded high prices in markets from Rome to Syria. The city's artisans benefited from the kingdom's position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, having access to raw materials and design influences from across the known world. Egyptian papyrus remained one of the kingdom's most valuable exports. The plant grew naturally in the Nile Delta, and Egyptian craftsmen had perfected the techniques for converting it into the writing material that was essential for administration, literature, and commerce throughout the Mediterranean. Cleopatra established new papyrus workshops and improved the quality control processes that ensured Egyptian papyrus maintained its reputation as the finest available. The Queen's economic policies also reflected her understanding of Egypt's unique position in Mediterranean trade networks. Alexandria's harbour was expanded and improved with new wharves and warehouses that could accommodate the increasing volume of commercial traffic. The city's merchants prospered as trade routes through Egypt connected the Roman world with India, Arabia, and the kingdoms of East Africa. Cleopatra herself took an active interest in these commercial relationships. She met regularly with merchant delegations from different regions, learning about market conditions, trade opportunities, and the goods that were in highest demand. Her linguistic abilities proved invaluable in these negotiations, as she could communicate directly with traders from many different cultures without relying on interpreters. The kingdom's financial situation improved dramatically during these years. The combination of increased agricultural productivity, expanding manufacturing, and growing trade revenues provided the resources necessary to fund ambitious construction projects while maintaining a substantial treasury reserve. Egypt's financial stability was enhanced by careful management of the kingdom's debts and a gradual reduction in its dependence on Roman creditors. Education and cultural development flourished under Cleopatra's patronage. The great library of Alexandria, damaged during the fighting that restored her to power, was rebuilt and expanded with new sections devoted to scientific research and technological innovation. The Queen personally recruited scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world, offering them generous support in exchange for their commitment to advancing human knowledge. The Museum of Alexandria, the research institution associated with the Great Library, became a center of scientific innovation during Cleopatra's reign. Mathematicians working there made important discoveries in geometry and number theory. Astronomers refined the calendar and improved techniques for predicting celestial events. Physicians advanced the understanding of human anatomy and developed new treatments for various diseases. The Queen's support for learning extended beyond Alexandria to other cities throughout Egypt. She established schools in Memphis, Thebes, and other major centers, ensuring that education was available to a broader segment of the population. These institutions taught not only traditional Egyptian subjects, but also Greek literature, Roman history, and the mathematical and scientific knowledge that was essential for the kingdom's continued prosperity. Religious life in Egypt also flourished during this period. Cleopatra understood that her legitimacy as pharaoh depended partly on her subjects' belief that she enjoyed the favor of the gods, and she took care to honor both Egyptian and Greek religious traditions. New temples were constructed, and existing ones were renovated and expanded. The Queen herself participated in important religious ceremonies, demonstrating her commitment to the spiritual welfare of her people. The temple complexes were not merely religious centers, but also important economic institutions. They controlled significant agricultural land, operated workshops and granaries, and served as local centers of learning and administration. Cleopatra's support for temple construction and renovation therefore had practical as well as religious benefits, strengthening the local institutions that helped maintain stability throughout the kingdom. The queen also used religious festivals and ceremonies as opportunities to reinforce the bonds between the monarchy and the people. When she appeared in public during major celebrations, wearing the traditional regalia of Pharaoh and participating in ancient rituals, she reminded her subjects of the continuity that connected her reign to the glorious dynasties of Egypt's past. These occasions were also opportunities for the people to see their queen's obvious prosperity and confidence, visible signs of divine favor that enhanced their own sense of security and pride. Family life brought Cleopatra personal satisfaction during these years of public success. Young Caesarion grew up in the palace, surrounded by the luxury and learning that characterized her court. The queen took an active role in his education, ensuring that he learned the languages, history, and skills that would prepare him for future leadership responsibilities. She also used her son's presence to strengthen her position politically, as his existence provided a potential bridge between Egypt and Rome. The palace itself was expanded and beautified during this period, becoming a showcase of Egyptian wealth and artistic achievement. New reception halls were constructed for diplomatic ceremonies, their walls decorated with scenes from Egyptian history and mythology, rendered in the traditional artistic style that had adorned pharaonic monuments for centuries. Gardens were redesigned with exotic plants from throughout the known world, creating spaces of extraordinary beauty where the queen could entertain foreign dignitaries and conduct informal diplomatic negotiations. Cleopatra's court attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean world. Foreign ambassadors, merchants, scholars, and artists came to Alexandria to experience the splendor of the Egyptian court and to participate in the intellectual and cultural life of the kingdom. These visitors carried stories of Egypt's prosperity back to their home countries, enhancing the kingdom's reputation and creating new opportunities for diplomatic and commercial relationships. The queen's personal style during this period reflected her confidence and success. Contemporary accounts describe her as a woman of striking presence who combined natural beauty with intelligence, education, and political skill. She dressed in the finest Egyptian textiles, adorned herself with jewelry that showcased the craftsmanship of the kingdom's artisans, and conducted herself with the dignity appropriate to her position as the heir to 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition. Yet beneath the surface, prosperity and stability, Cleopatra was acutely aware that Egypt's future remained tied to the complex and often unpredictable world of Roman politics. Caesar's continued success in his various military campaigns provided security for the Egyptian alliance, but the queen knew that political situations could change rapidly and that she needed to prepare for various contingencies. The letters and diplomatic communications that flowed between Alexandria and Rome during this period reveal a ruler who was carefully monitoring developments throughout the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra maintained agents and informants in major cities, ensuring that she would receive early warning of any political changes that might affect Egypt's interests. She also continued to cultivate relationships with Roman politicians and military leaders who might prove useful allies if circumstances required new diplomatic initiatives. As 44 BCE approached, few observers could have predicted that the golden years of Cleopatra's reign were about to be tested by events that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. The queen had succeeded in creating a prosperous and stable kingdom, had established herself as one of the region's most capable rulers, and had built a strong foundation for Egypt's continued independence and success. The challenges that lay ahead would require all of her intelligence, courage, and diplomatic skill. But the achievements of these peaceful years had demonstrated that she possessed the qualities necessary to meet whatever tests the future might bring. The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, dawned clear and bright in Rome, where the business of governing the Mediterranean world continued its daily rhythm. In Alexandria, nearly 1,000 miles away, Cleopatra was conducting her usual morning audiences in the royal palace, listening to reports from provincial governors and discussing trade negotiations with merchant representatives. Neither she nor anyone else in Egypt could have imagined that, before the day ended, an event would occur that would fundamentally alter the course of history and place her kingdom in mortal danger. The news of Julius Caesar's assassination reached Alexandria several days later, carried by a Roman merchant ship whose captain had witnessed the chaos that erupted in Rome following the dictator's death. As the messenger delivered his report in the palace's main reception hall, Cleopatra maintained the composed exterior that was expected of a pharaoh, but those who knew her well could see the shock and concern that flickered briefly across her features. Caesar's death represented far more than the loss of a political ally or even a personal friend. The Roman general had been the cornerstone of Egypt's security, the guarantor of the kingdom's independence, and the father of her son. His assassination left Cleopatra in an extraordinarily vulnerable position, ruling a wealthy kingdom that many Romans viewed as a prize to be claimed by whoever emerged victorious from the civil wars that would inevitably follow Caesar's death. The immediate aftermath of the assassination plunged the Roman world into uncertainty and conflict. Caesar's assassins, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, had struck down the dictator in the name of republican liberty, but they had made no coherent plans for governing Rome after his death. The result was a power vacuum that various ambitious men rushed to fill, each claiming to represent Caesar's true legacy or the authentic traditions of the Roman Republic. In Alexandria, Cleopatra called together her most trusted advisors to assess the new situation. The discussions that took place in the palace's private council chambers during those tense spring days would determine Egypt's strategy for surviving the coming storm. The Queen's education in history and politics served her well as she analyzed the various Roman factions and their likely actions. Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony, emerged as one of the most significant players in the post-assassination struggle. As Caesar's lieutenant and consul, he possessed both legitimate authority and military resources. He also had personal reasons to oppose the dictator's assassins, having been Caesar's loyal supporter and friend. For Cleopatra, Antony represented a potential ally who might be willing to continue Caesar's policy of cooperation with Egypt. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 19-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir, presented a more complex challenge. Though young and politically inexperienced, he carried the powerful name of Caesar and could claim to be the legitimate successor to the dictator's authority. His youth might be seen as a weakness, but it also meant that he was less predictable than older, more established politicians. The Republican faction, led by Brutus and Cassius, controlled significant military forces and enjoyed support among Romans who genuinely believed that Caesar's death would restore traditional republican government. However, their political program remained vague, and their military resources were concentrated in the eastern provinces where they might pose a direct threat to Egypt. Cleopatra's response to these developments demonstrated the political wisdom that had already served her so well. Rather than immediately committing Egypt to support any particular Roman faction, she adopted a strategy of careful observation while quietly preparing for various contingencies. She ordered the strengthening of Alexandria's defenses and increased the training and equipment of the royal army. She also began accumulating the financial resources that might be needed to purchase military support or political alliances. The Queen's agents throughout the Mediterranean world were instructed to monitor developments closely and to maintain communications with all significant Roman leaders. This policy reflected her understanding that the ultimate victor in Rome's civil wars might emerge from an unexpected source, and that Egypt's survival would depend on her ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. During the summer of 44 BCE, as the various Roman factions maneuvered for position, Cleopatra faced pressure from some of her advisors to take more decisive action. Some urged her to support Antony immediately, arguing that his loyalty to Caesar made him the natural ally of Caesar's former partner. Others suggested backing Octavian, reasoning that his youth and relative weakness would make him more amenable to Egyptian influence. The Queen resisted these pressures, maintaining her policy of watchful neutrality while continuing to strengthen Egypt internally. She understood that premature commitment to any Roman faction could prove disastrous if that faction were defeated. But she also recognized that complete passivity might be interpreted as weakness or hostility by whoever eventually gained control in Rome. Her position was complicated by the presence of Caesarion, whose existence created both opportunities and dangers in the new political environment. Some Romans might accept the boy as Caesar's legitimate heir, providing Egypt with a claim to influence in Roman affairs. Others might view him as a threat to be eliminated or a valuable hostage to be controlled. Cleopatra took elaborate precautions to ensure her son's safety, while considering how his existence might be used to Egypt's advantage. The autumn of 44 BCE brought the first direct test of Egypt's position when Cassius arrived in Syria with a substantial army, clearly intending to use the province as a base for operations against Caesar's supporters. As the governor of a neighboring region, Cassius had the authority to demand assistance from Egypt, and he sent envoys to Alexandria requesting ships, money, and supplies for his campaign. Cleopatra's response to this demand was a masterpiece of diplomatic subtlety. She agreed in principle to provide assistance to the Roman governor, demonstrating Egypt's loyalty to legitimate authority. However, she cited various practical difficulties that would delay the actual delivery of aid. Ships were needed for the grain harvest, the royal treasury was committed to existing obligations, and administrative procedures required time to complete. These delays served multiple purposes. They allowed Cleopatra to avoid openly defying Cassius while preventing Egypt from becoming too closely associated with his cause. They also provided time to observe how the military situation developed and to adjust Egypt's position accordingly. If Cassius proved successful, the aid could eventually be provided with appropriate explanations for the delays. If he were defeated, Egypt could claim that it had never actually supported his rebellion against Caesar's legitimate successors. The strategy proved prescient when Antony and Octavian formed an alliance in late 44 BCE, combining their forces against the Republican faction. The formation of what would become known as the Second Triumvirate, with the addition of Marcus Lepidus, fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Roman world. Cassius and Brutus suddenly found themselves facing superior enemy forces, and their demands for Egyptian assistance became more urgent and desperate. Cleopatra continued her policy of delay and equivocation, but she also began to prepare for the possibility that the triumvirs might emerge victorious. Her agents made discreet contact with representatives of Antony and Octavian, conveying Egypt's willingness to cooperate with legitimate Roman authority, while emphasizing the kingdom's valuable contributions to Mediterranean stability and prosperity. The Queen also used this period to consolidate her position within Egypt. The uncertainty surrounding Roman politics had created some anxiety among her subjects, and she took steps to reassure them that Egypt remained strong and secure. Public works projects were accelerated to provide employment and demonstrate the government's stability. Religious ceremonies were conducted with particular solemnity to invoke divine protection for the kingdom. The winter of 44-43 BCE passed quietly in Alexandria, but everyone understood that major military campaigns would begin with the spring. The fate of the Roman world, and therefore of Egypt, would be determined by battles fought in distant lands by armies commanded by men Cleopatra had never met. Her kingdom's future depended on her ability to position Egypt advantageously, regardless of which Roman faction ultimately prevailed. As 43 BCE began, the Queen could look back on nearly a year of successful crisis management. Egypt had avoided premature commitments that might have proved disastrous, had maintained its internal stability despite external uncertainty, and had preserved its options for the future. The most dangerous phase of the crisis still lay ahead, but Cleopatra had demonstrated once again that she possessed the wisdom and patience necessary to navigate even the most treacherous political waters. The young pharaoh who had once hidden in a carpet to approach Julius Caesar had matured into a ruler of exceptional diplomatic skill. The challenges that awaited her would test every aspect of her intelligence and determination, but the careful groundwork laid during these months of uncertainty had positioned Egypt to survive and prosper regardless of how the Roman civil wars ultimately concluded. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Kidnus River as it flowed gently through the ancient city of Tarsus in 41 BCE. Along the riverbank, crowds of curious citizens had gathered to witness an event that would become one of history's most famous encounters. Word had spread throughout the city that Cleopatra, the legendary Queen of Egypt, was approaching by water to meet Mark Antony, now the most powerful Roman in the eastern Mediterranean. The years since Caesar's assassination had been kind to Cleopatra's careful diplomatic strategy. The Republican forces led by Brutus and Cassius had been decisively defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, eliminating the threat they had posed to Egypt and to Caesar's political heirs. The Roman world was now divided between the surviving triumvirs, with Antony controlling the wealthy eastern provinces, while Octavian consolidated his authority in the west. For Egypt, this division of Roman power created both opportunities and challenges. Antony's control of the eastern Mediterranean meant that he would be the Roman leader with whom Cleopatra would need to work most closely. His reputation as a capable military commander and his loyalty to Caesar's memory suggested that he might be a valuable ally for Egypt. However, his well-known appetite for luxury and pleasure also indicated that he might prove more demanding and less predictable than Caesar had been. The summons to meet Antony at Tarsus had not been entirely unexpected. As the ruler of a wealthy kingdom within his sphere of influence, Cleopatra could reasonably be called upon to demonstrate her loyalty to Roman authority and to discuss Egypt's role in Antony's plans for governing the eastern provinces. However, the manner of the summons, delivered through subordinate officials rather than as a diplomatic invitation between equals, suggested that Antony might not fully appreciate Egypt's importance or Cleopatra's status as an independent monarch. The Queen's response to this challenge was characteristically bold and theatrical. Rather than traveling to Tarsus as a suppliant seeking favor from a Roman magistrate, she would arrive as befitted the heir to Alexander the Great and the pharaohs of Egypt. The preparations for her journey began weeks in advance and were designed to create an impression that would establish the proper tone for all subsequent negotiations. The royal barge that carried Cleopatra up the Cydnus River was a masterpiece of Egyptian craftsmanship and artistic achievement. Its hull was covered with gold leaf that caught and reflected the sunlight, while its purple sails, dyed with the most expensive pigments available, announced the presence of royalty from miles away. The vessel's decorations drew upon the religious and mythological traditions that had inspired Egyptian art for centuries, creating a floating temple that proclaimed the divine nature of pharaonic authority. Cleopatra herself appeared as the goddess Aphrodite, the Greek deity of love and beauty whom the Romans called Venus. This choice was both politically astute and personally meaningful. Aphrodite was associated with divine favor and irresistible attraction, qualities that the queen hoped to project in her dealings with Antony. The goddess was also connected to the sea and to navigation, making her an appropriate patron for a river journey. Most importantly, Venus was claimed as an ancestral deity by the Julian family, creating a symbolic link between Cleopatra's divine persona and the memory of Julius Caesar. The queen's costume and regalia were carefully chosen to enhance this divine identification. She wore robes of the finest silk, dyed in colors that seemed to shift and shimmer in the changing light. Her jewelry incorporated the traditional symbols of Egyptian royalty. The cobra and the vulture worked in gold and precious stones that had been crafted by the kingdom's most skilled artisans. Her makeup and hairstyle followed Egyptian conventions that emphasized her eyes and gave her an otherworldly, statuesque appearance. The barge itself was populated with carefully chosen attendants who completed the theatrical tableau. Young men dressed as cupids operated fans of peacock feathers, creating gentle breezes that provided comfort and added movement to the scene. Women costumed as sea nymphs played musical instruments and sang hymns appropriate to the goddess whom their queen represented. The entire production was designed to create an impression of divine splendor that would establish Cleopatra's prestige before any negotiations began. As the royal barge approached Tarsus, its appearance created exactly the effect Cleopatra had intended. The crowds that lined the riverbank had never seen anything comparable to this display of wealth, artistry, and royal pageantry. Word spread quickly through the city that the Egyptian queen's arrival surpassed anything in local memory, and curiosity about the woman who could command such resources drew increasing numbers of spectators to the waterfront. Antony himself was conducting business in the city's forum when reports reached him of the extraordinary vessel approaching Tarsus. Initially, he appears to have been somewhat annoyed by what he may have interpreted as an attempt to upstage his own authority. However, as more detailed descriptions of the spectacle reached him, his curiosity was aroused, and he made his way to the harbour to see for himself what all the excitement was about. The Roman general's first sight of Cleopatra's barge must have been a revelation. Antony was an experienced traveller who had seen the luxury and pageantry of many Eastern courts, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the combination of artistic sophistication, religious symbolism, and sheer theatrical audacity that the Egyptian queen had assembled for their meeting. The display demonstrated not only Egypt's wealth, but also its cultural achievements and the queen's own intelligence and creativity. When Cleopatra finally disembarked from her golden barge, she did so with the same careful attention to dramatic effect that had characterized her entire approach to Tarsus. She was carried ashore in a litter that continued the mythological themes of her river journey, surrounded by attendants whose costumes and behavior maintained the illusion that a goddess was honoring the mortal world with her presence. The crowd's reaction was one of awe and admiration, creating an atmosphere that was more like a religious festival than a diplomatic meeting. Antony's initial encounter with Cleopatra took place in a pavilion that had been erected near the harbour for their private discussions. Away from the crowds and the theatrical trappings, the two rulers were able to assess each other as individuals and to begin the complex negotiations that would determine their future relationship. Both were experienced politicians who understood the importance of first impressions, and both had reason to be satisfied with the initial phase of their encounter. For Antony, Cleopatra represented a fascinating combination of beauty, intelligence, and power that appealed to both his political and personal interests. Her dramatic arrival had demonstrated that she was far from an ordinary client ruler seeking Roman favor. Instead, she appeared to be a potential partner who could contribute significantly to his ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Her obvious wealth and the sophistication of her court suggested that an alliance with Egypt could provide both the resources and the prestige that would enhance his position in competition with Octavian. For Cleopatra, the meeting with Antony offered opportunities that she had been preparing for since Caesar's assassination. The Roman general's military reputation and political authority made him a valuable potential ally who could provide the security that Egypt needed to maintain its independence. His apparent appreciation for luxury and culture suggested that he might be more amenable than some Roman leaders to treating Egypt as an equal partner rather than a subordinate province. Their initial conversations revealed that both rulers shared certain fundamental interests that could form the basis for a lasting alliance. Antony needed Egypt's financial resources to fund his military campaigns and administrative expenses. Cleopatra needed Roman protection to preserve her kingdom's independence and security. Both had reasons to oppose Octavian, who represented a threat to Antony's position in the East and to Egypt's autonomy. The personal chemistry between the two leaders was evident from their first meetings. Antony was charmed by Cleopatra's intelligence and wit, while she appreciated his straightforward manner and his obvious respect for her abilities. Unlike some Romans who viewed Eastern rulers with condescension, Antony treated the Egyptian queen as a fellow sovereign whose opinions and concerns deserved serious consideration. As their discussions continued over several days in Tarsus, the outlines of a mutually beneficial partnership began to emerge. Egypt would provide financial support for Antony's military and political activities, while Rome would guarantee the kingdom's security and independence. Both rulers would cooperate in governing the eastern Mediterranean, with Egypt serving as Antony's principal ally in the region. The negotiations also addressed more immediate concerns, including the fate of various political enemies and the resolution of territorial disputes that had arisen in the aftermath of the recent civil wars. Cleopatra's requests were generally reasonable and reflected her understanding of the political realities that constrained Antony's freedom of action. In return, she offered assistance that would genuinely strengthen his position and advance his interests. By the time their meetings in Tarsus concluded, both Cleopatra and Antony had achieved their primary objectives. The queen had established Egypt as Rome's most important ally in the East, while the Roman general had secured the resources and partnership that would support his future ambitions. More importantly, they had discovered a personal compatibility that promised to make their political alliance both effective and enduring. The famous meeting at Tarsus thus marked the beginning of one of history's most significant partnerships. The careful planning and dramatic flair that Cleopatra had brought to their first encounter established a pattern of intelligence, creativity, and mutual respect that would characterize their relationship for years to come. The last pharaoh of Egypt had found in Mark Antony a partner worthy of her abilities and ambitions. The winter of 41 BCE brought an unusual peace to Alexandria as Cleopatra and Mark Antony established the rhythms of their new partnership. The Roman general had accepted the queen's invitation to spend the colder months in Egypt, where the climate was more forgiving than in northern climes, and where the resources of the royal treasury could support his political and military planning in comfort and style. Their collaboration during these months revealed the depth of their mutual attraction and the genuine compatibility of their interests. Antony found in Cleopatra not only a beautiful and charming companion, but also an intelligent advisor whose understanding of Eastern Mediterranean politics complemented his own military and administrative experience. The queen, for her part, discovered in the Roman general a man who appreciated her abilities and treated her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate ally. The palace in Alexandria became the center of their joint activities, hosting a court that combined Roman political traditions with Egyptian royal customs. Foreign ambassadors found themselves participating in ceremonies that drew upon both cultures, while local officials adapted to the presence of Roman advisors and military officers. The fusion of traditions wasn't always seamless, but it created an atmosphere of cosmopolitan sophistication that impressed visitors from throughout the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's famous banquets during this period were more than mere entertainment. They served as diplomatic occasions where political business was conducted in settings designed to demonstrate Egyptian wealth and cultural achievement. The queen's attention to detail in planning these events revealed her understanding that politics in the ancient world was often conducted through personal relationships and social interactions. The most celebrated of these banquets was the occasion when Cleopatra supposedly dissolved a pearl of enormous value in vinegar and drank the mixture to demonstrate her kingdom's wealth. While the story may be embellished in later retellings, it captures the spirit of theatrical magnificence that characterized the Queen's approach to diplomacy. Every gesture was calculated to reinforce Egypt's status as a major power deserving of respect and consideration. Antony's response to these displays was generally appreciative, though he sometimes seems to have been overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of Egyptian court life. As a Roman accustomed to the relative simplicity of republican traditions, he found himself in a world where kingship was invested with religious significance and where royal ceremonies drew upon thousands of years of cultural development. His willingness to participate in these unfamiliar rituals demonstrated his respect for Cleopatra and his recognition of Egypt's importance to his own ambitions. The winter months also provided opportunities for more private interactions between the two rulers. They spent time exploring Alexandria together, visiting the great library and the museum, touring the harbor and commercial districts, and sailing on the Nile Delta. These excursions allowed them to develop a personal relationship that went beyond their political alliance, creating bonds of affection and mutual understanding that would prove crucial in the challenges ahead. Cleopatra used these occasions to educate Antony about Egypt's unique character and capabilities. She showed him the agricultural systems that made the kingdom the Mediterranean's breadbasket, the manufacturing workshops that produced luxury goods prized throughout the Roman world, and the commercial networks that connected Egypt to markets in Africa, Arabia, and India. Her goal was to help him understand that Egypt was not simply another wealthy province to be exploited, but a sophisticated civilization that could contribute to Roman success through partnership rather than subjugation. The Roman general was genuinely impressed by what he saw. His military background had given him an appreciation for logistical capabilities and organizational efficiency, and he recognized that Egypt's administrative systems were superior to those of many Roman provinces. The kingdom's ability to feed itself and export substantial grain surpluses, its manufacturing capabilities, and its commercial connections all represented valuable assets that could support his political and military ambitions. During the spring of 40 BCE, their partnership faced its first serious test when news arrived that Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had initiated a rebellion against Octavian in Italy. The conflict, known as the Perusine War, threatened to undermine the delicate balance of power between the triumvirs and potentially force Antony to choose between his eastern ambitions and his obligations in the Roman heartland. Cleopatra's response to this crisis demonstrated her political maturity and her commitment to their alliance. Rather than trying to prevent Antony from addressing Roman affairs, she encouraged him to take whatever action was necessary to protect his interests. She offered to provide financial support for his military activities and promised to maintain their partnership regardless of how the Italian situation developed. The Queen's support during this difficult period strengthened Antony's appreciation for her loyalty and political wisdom. When he departed Alexandria in the spring of 40 BCE to deal with the crisis in Italy, he did so with the confidence that his most important ally understood the complexities of his situation and would work to preserve their partnership despite the temporary separation. The months that followed tested both rulers' diplomatic skills as they navigated the changing currents of Roman politics from a distance. Antony's negotiations with Octavian led to a temporary reconciliation between the triumvirs and to his marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia, a political alliance designed to cement their renewed cooperation. For Cleopatra, this development represented a potential threat to her relationship with Antony and to Egypt's position as his primary Eastern ally. However, the Queen's response to these challenges revealed the depth of her political sophistication. Rather than protesting Antony's marriage or attempting to undermine his negotiations with Octavian, she maintained a dignified silence while quietly strengthening Egypt's position and preparing for various contingencies. She understood that premature interference in Roman domestic politics could prove counterproductive, and that her best strategy was to demonstrate Egypt's value through continued prosperity and stability. The birth of twins to Cleopatra and Antony in 40 BCE added a personal dimension to their political partnership that would influence their relationship for years to come. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named for the sun and moon respectively, represented both the continuation of the Ptolemaic dynasty and a potential bridge between Egyptian and Roman interests. Their existence created bonds between their parents that went beyond political calculation, while also providing additional stakes in the success of their alliance. During Antony's absence from the eastern Mediterranean, Cleopatra proved herself capable of managing regional affairs independently. She maintained diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms, supervised Egypt's internal administration, and continued the economic and cultural policies that had made her reign so successful. Her ability to govern effectively without Roman oversight demonstrated that she was far more than merely Antony's local representative, but a genuinely capable ruler in her own right. The Queen also used this period to strengthen Egypt's military capabilities, understanding that future challenges might require the kingdom to defend itself or to contribute more substantially to joint military operations. The royal army was expanded and modernized, the navy was enlarged and equipped with improved vessels, and the kingdom's fortifications were upgraded to meet contemporary standards. When Antony returned to the east in 37 BCE, he found Egypt more prosperous and secure than ever before. Cleopatra's successful management of the kingdom during his absence had enhanced his respect for her abilities and reinforced his appreciation for the partnership they had created. Their reunion in Antioch marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one characterized by deeper personal bonds and more extensive political cooperation. The negotiations that took place in Antioch during 37 BCE resulted in formal agreements that defined the scope of their alliance more precisely than had been possible during their initial meetings at Tarsus. Egypt's status as Rome's principal ally in the eastern Mediterranean was confirmed, while Cleopatra's authority over her kingdom and certain neighboring territories was formally recognized by Roman authority. The personal dimension of their relationship was also formalized during this period when Antony went through a ceremony of marriage with Cleopatra according to Egyptian custom. While this union was not recognized under Roman law, It demonstrated his commitment to their partnership and his respect for Egyptian traditions. The ceremony itself was conducted with the full pageantry appropriate to a pharaonic wedding, reinforcing Cleopatra's status as a legitimate monarch and Antony's position as her chosen consort. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony that crystallized during these years represented one of the most significant partnerships in ancient history. It combined the wealth and cultural sophistication of Egypt with the military power and political authority of Rome's eastern provinces. More importantly, it was based on genuine mutual respect and affection between two rulers who understood each other's strengths and shared compatible ambitions for the future of the Mediterranean world. The gentle lapping of waves against the marble steps of Alexandria's royal harbour provided a peaceful counterpoint to the increasingly urgent discussions taking place within the palace walls during the summer of 32 BCE. Cleopatra and Mark Antony, now partners in both love and statecraft for over 8 years, found themselves facing the greatest challenge of their careers as the final confrontation with Octavian approached like an inevitable storm. The years since their reunion at Antioch had been marked by both triumph and growing tension. Their partnership had brought stability and prosperity to the eastern Mediterranean, but it had also alarmed many Romans who viewed the alliance between their general and the Egyptian queen as a threat to traditional Roman values and interests. Octavian, now calling himself Caesar in honor of his adoptive father, had skillfully exploited these concerns to build support for what he portrayed as a necessary war to preserve Roman independence from foreign influence. The propaganda war that preceded the military conflict revealed the sophisticated understanding of public opinion that characterized politics in the late Roman Republic. Octavian's supporters portrayed Antony as a Roman general who had been corrupted by Eastern luxury and seduced into betraying his homeland by a foreign queen whose ambitions threatened Rome's sovereignty. They emphasized Cleopatra's wealth, her foreign customs, and her claims to divine status as evidence that she represented everything that was antithetical to Roman republican traditions. Cleopatra and Antony responded with their own propaganda campaign that emphasized their legitimate authority in the eastern provinces and their commitment to preserving the Roman Empire's stability and prosperity. They pointed to their successful administration of the eastern Mediterranean, the security they had provided to Roman interests in the region, and their respect for Roman constitutional traditions. They also highlighted Octavian's youth, his lack of significant military experience, and his own authoritarian tendencies as evidence that he was the real threat to republican government. The Queen's role in this propaganda war was particularly complex because of her status as both a foreign monarch and the mother of Julius Caesar's son. Her supporters emphasized her intelligence, her education, and her successful governance of Egypt as evidence that she was a valuable ally rather than a dangerous enemy. They also pointed to Caesarion's existence as proof that her relationship with Rome's leaders was based on legitimate political and personal bonds rather than mere ambition or manipulation. However, Cleopatra's foreign status and her claims to represent ancient traditions of divine kingship made her vulnerable to attacks from those who portrayed the conflict as a struggle between Roman and foreign values. Her wealth and the magnificence of her court, which had once been assets in diplomatic negotiations, now became liabilities as Octavian's propagandists used them to argue that she represented the kind of Eastern decadence that threatened to corrupt Roman virtue. The military preparations that accompanied this war of words revealed the enormous resources that both sides could bring to bear in the coming conflict. Antony's forces included not only his own experienced legions, but also substantial contingents provided by Egypt and other allied kingdoms throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The combined army represented one of the largest military forces ever assembled in the ancient world, with troops drawn from dozens of different regions and cultures. Cleopatra's contribution to these military preparations went far beyond the financial support that many expected from a wealthy ally. Egyptian ships formed a significant portion of the combined fleet. Egyptian craftsmen produced weapons and equipment for the army, and Egyptian administrators helped organize the complex logistics required to supply such a massive force. The queen herself took an active role in strategic planning, drawing upon her extensive knowledge of Eastern Mediterranean geography and politics. The naval preparations were particularly important given the likelihood that much of the coming conflict would be decided on the water. Egypt's Mediterranean fleet was expanded and modernized, with new vessels constructed according to the latest designs and equipped with improved weapons and armor. Experienced Egyptian mariners trained alongside Roman sailors to create an integrated naval force capable of challenging Octavian's fleet on equal terms. The winter of 33 to 32 BCE was spent in intensive preparation for the campaign that would begin with the following year's fighting season. Antony established his headquarters at Ephesus, where he could coordinate with allied forces throughout the region while remaining in close communication with Cleopatra in Alexandria. The queen made several visits to his headquarters, participating in strategy sessions and demonstrating her commitment to their joint cause. These meetings revealed the extent to which their partnership had evolved since their first encounter at Tarsus more than 8 years earlier. Cleopatra was now not merely Antony's ally, but his trusted advisor on military and political matters. Her opinions carried significant weight in strategic discussions, and her knowledge of regional conditions influenced major tactical decisions. The Roman officers who served under Antony had learned to respect her judgment and to recognize her valuable contributions to their collective efforts. The spring of 32 BCE brought the beginning of the military movements that would culminate in the Battle of Actium. Antony's forces moved westward from their bases in Asia Minor, establishing positions along the western coast of Greece, where they could threaten Italy while maintaining secure supply lines to their eastern territories. The combined fleet took up positions at Actium, controlling the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf and threatening Octavian's communications with his supporters in the eastern provinces. Cleopatra accompanied this westward movement, bringing with her the Egyptian fleet and a substantial treasure that could finance extended military operations. Her presence with the army was controversial among some of Antony's Roman supporters, who feared that her obvious influence over their commander would provide additional ammunition for Octavian's propaganda campaign. However, Antony insisted on her participation, recognizing that her resources and advice were essential to their success. The establishment of their base at Actium created a situation of strategic stalemate that lasted through much of the summer of 32 BCE. Both armies were too strong to be attacked directly, and both commanders hoped that their opponents would be forced by logistical difficulties or political pressures to take risks that would create opportunities for decisive action. The resulting period of watchful waiting tested the patience and discipline of both forces while allowing time for negotiations and political maneuvering. During these months of preparation and anticipation, Cleopatra and Antony spent countless hours discussing the future they hoped to create if their cause proved successful. Their vision for the Mediterranean world involved a partnership between East and West that would preserve the best elements of both Roman and Hellenistic traditions while creating new opportunities for prosperity and cultural development. They imagined cities where Greek learning and Roman efficiency would combine to advance human knowledge and achievement. The personal dimension of their relationship provided comfort and strength during these stressful months. Their children, now including not only the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, but also young Ptolemy Philadelphus, represented both the continuation of their individual dynasties and the hope for a future that would unite Egyptian and Roman interests. The family they had created together gave both rulers additional motivation to succeed in the coming conflict. As the summer of 32 BCE progressed and the likelihood of decisive battle increased, both Cleopatra and Antony understood that they were approaching a moment that would determine not only their personal fates, but the future course of Mediterranean civilization. The careful preparations they had made over many months would soon be tested in combat, and the alliance they had built through years of partnership would face its ultimate trial. The queen who had once arrived at Tarsus, dressed as a goddess, now prepared for a battle that would determine whether the ancient kingdom of Egypt would survive as an independent nation or become merely another province in an expanding Roman Empire. The stakes could not have been higher, and both rulers understood that everything they had worked to achieve now depended on their ability to prevail in the confrontation that awaited them at Actium. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, dawned calm and clear over the waters near Actium, where two of history's greatest naval forces prepared for a battle that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. In her flagship, Cleopatra stood at the stern rail, watching the sun rise over the peaceful sea that would soon be transformed into a theater of war. The Egyptian queen wore the traditional armor of a pharaoh, its golden surfaces catching the early light, while her mind focused on the crucial decisions that lay ahead. The battle that followed would be remembered not for its tactical brilliance or the heroism of individual combatants, but for the way a single moment of decision changed the course of history. As the opposing fleets maneuvered for position and the first exchanges of missiles began, Cleopatra found herself facing a choice that would define her legacy and determine Egypt's future. The winds that day favored neither side decisively, but they carried the scent of destiny. Contemporary accounts of the Battle of Actium vary in their details, but they agree that at a critical moment in the fighting, Cleopatra's squadron broke away from the main engagement and sailed southward toward Egypt. Whether this movement represented a planned withdrawal, a tactical maneuver gone wrong, or a sudden decision born of desperation, has been debated by historians for centuries. What is certain is that Antony, seeing his partner's ships departing, chose to follow her rather than continue the battle with his remaining forces. The immediate result of their departure was the collapse of resistance among their remaining allies. Deprived of their commanders and uncertain about the battle's progress, many ships surrendered to Octavian's forces, while others attempted to escape individually. The great alliance that had controlled the eastern Mediterranean for nearly a decade dissolved in a matter of hours, leaving Octavian master of the Roman world and Cleopatra and Antony fugitives seeking safety in Alexandria. The journey back to Egypt must have been one of the most difficult periods in both rulers' lives. The ships that had departed Actium in such haste carried not only the remnants of their naval force, but also the weight of shattered dreams and uncertain futures. The Mediterranean, which had once seemed like a highway connecting their empire, now felt like a hostile expanse separating them from safety. During the long days at sea, Cleopatra and Antony had time to reflect on the decisions that had brought them to this point, and to consider their remaining options. The Queen's thoughts often turned to her children, particularly young Caesarion, whose claim to Julius Caesar's legacy had been one of the factors motivating Octavian's relentless hostility. She knew that, regardless of what happened to her, she needed to ensure their safety and preserve whatever possibilities remained for Egypt's independence. Alexandria welcomed them back with the mixture of relief and apprehension that characterized the city throughout these final months. The population understood that their queen and her Roman ally had suffered a serious defeat, but they also hoped that Egypt's wealth and defensive advantages might yet provide the foundation for continued resistance. The royal palace, which had witnessed so many triumphs during Cleopatra's reign, now became the center of increasingly desperate planning for an uncertain future. The immediate challenge was to assess what military and financial resources remained available for continued resistance. Egypt's armies had not been significantly damaged at Actium, since most of the kingdom's land forces had remained at home to guard against potential threats from other directions. The royal treasury, while diminished by years of supporting military campaigns, still contained substantial reserves that could fund defensive preparations or provide bargaining chips in negotiations. Cleopatra approached these challenges with the same intelligence and determination that had characterized her entire reign. She ordered the strengthening of Alexandria's fortifications, the mobilization of additional troops, and the preparation of the royal fleet for potential evacuation if circumstances required it. She also initiated diplomatic contacts with various potential allies, hoping to find support for continued resistance or at least favorable terms for eventual surrender. The most painful of these diplomatic initiatives involved exploring the possibility of separate negotiations with Octavian. Cleopatra understood that her partnership with Antony, while personally meaningful and politically valuable, might now represent an obstacle to securing favorable treatment for Egypt and its people. The Queen's willingness to consider such options demonstrated her commitment to her kingdom's welfare, even when it conflicted with her personal loyalties. Antony's response to their defeat was more emotional and less constructive than his partner's practical preparations. The Roman general, who had built his reputation on military success and political astuteness, found himself struggling to accept the magnitude of their failure and its implications for his future. His periods of depression and withdrawal placed additional burdens on Cleopatra, who had to manage both the kingdom's crisis and her partner's psychological difficulties. During the winter of 31 to 30 BCE, Alexandria took on an atmosphere of surreal normalcy as daily life continued despite the approaching threat of Roman invasion. The city's markets remained active, though merchants increasingly dealt in goods that could be easily transported or hidden. The great library continued its scholarly activities, though some valuable manuscripts were quietly moved to safer locations. The palace maintained its ceremonial routines, though everyone understood that they might be witnessing the final months of Ptolemaic rule. Cleopatra used this period to complete various personal and political arrangements that would protect her interests regardless of how the crisis resolved. She made provisions for her children's safety, including plans for possible evacuation to allied kingdoms in Africa or Asia. She secured important documents and treasures in hidden locations throughout Egypt. Most importantly, she prepared detailed instructions for the kingdom's administration in case of her death or departure. The queen also spent considerable time in the royal tomb complex, where the mummified bodies of her Ptolemaic ancestors rested in golden sarcophagi surrounded by the treasures that had accompanied them into the afterlife. These visits provided her with perspective on the long history of her dynasty and reminded her that individual reigns, however successful, represented only brief chapters in the continuing story of Egyptian civilization. Spring brought news that Octavian's forces were approaching Egypt from multiple directions, making it clear that the final confrontation could not be postponed much longer. The Roman commander had spent the winter consolidating his control over the territories formerly governed by Antony and preparing for the campaign that would complete his victory. His forces included not only his own experienced legions, but also substantial numbers of troops who had previously served under his defeated rivals. As Octavian's armies drew closer to Alexandria, both Cleopatra and Antony made their final preparations for what they knew would be their last stand. The city's defenses were as strong as human effort could make them, but everyone understood that they were vastly outnumbered and could not realistically hope to defeat the approaching Roman forces in open battle. Their only remaining hope lay in the possibility that stubborn resistance might convince Octavian to offer acceptable terms for surrender. The last weeks of Cleopatra's reign were marked by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to find some path to survival for herself, her kingdom, and her children. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering various forms of tribute and submission. She explored the possibility of escaping to allied kingdoms beyond Roman reach. She even considered the ultimate sacrifice of ending her own life to remove what Octavian might see as the primary obstacle to a negotiated settlement. The final meeting between Cleopatra and Antony took place in the palace garden, where they had spent so many peaceful hours during the happier years of their partnership. The jasmine was in bloom, and the fountains bubbled softly among the palm trees, creating an oasis of beauty and tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the approaching catastrophe. They spoke of their children, their shared memories, and their regrets about the choices that had brought them to this point. When Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had already died, his response was immediate and tragic. The Roman general, unable to imagine a future without his Egyptian partner, took his own life with his sword, following the Roman tradition that preferred honorable death to shameful defeat. His final act reflected both his love for Cleopatra and his understanding that capture by Octavian would mean public humiliation and execution. Cleopatra's discovery of Antony's death marked the end of their extraordinary partnership and the beginning of her final negotiations with the approaching Romans. Octavian's representatives made it clear that while the queen's life might be spared, her independence would not be. Egypt would become a Roman province, and she would be expected to participate in the victor's triumph in Rome, where she would be displayed as a symbol of his success. The prospect of being paraded through Roman streets as a captive queen was intolerable to a woman who had spent her entire life as the heir to Alexander the Great and the pharaohs of Egypt. Cleopatra's final decision reflected her understanding that how one died could be as important as how one lived, and that preserving her dignity in death might accomplish more than accepting humiliation in life. On August 12, 30 BCE, in the privacy of her palace chambers, Cleopatra, the seventh Philopator, ended her own life in a manner that has become the subject of legend and speculation. Whether she died from the bite of an asp, as popular tradition claims, or from poison concealed in a hairpin or other object, her death represented both a personal tragedy and the end of an era in Mediterranean history. The queen's death also marked the end of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt and the conclusion of the Hellenistic period that had begun with Alexander the Great's conquests 3 centuries earlier. The kingdom that had been the Mediterranean's most prosperous and culturally sophisticated state became a Roman province, its wealth redirected to support the growing empire's military and administrative needs. Yet Cleopatra's legacy extended far beyond the political and military events of her lifetime. She had demonstrated that intelligence, education, and diplomatic skill could enable even a relatively small kingdom to play a significant role in international affairs. Her partnership with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony had shown that alliances based on mutual respect and shared interests could achieve remarkable results, even in an era dominated by military force. Most importantly, Cleopatra had proven that a woman could rule successfully in the ancient world's male-dominated political environment. Her achievements as pharaoh, diplomat, and strategist provided inspiration for later generations of women who sought to exercise political authority and influence. The stories told about her life, while often embellished with romantic and mythological elements, preserved the memory of a ruler who had combined feminine charm with masculine political skills. The last queen of Egypt died as she had lived, on her own terms and according to her own values. In choosing death over dishonor, she ensured that her memory would be preserved as that of a monarch who had never compromised her dignity or accepted defeat. The asp that allegedly ended her life became a symbol of Egyptian resistance to foreign domination, while her story provided inspiration for countless works of literature, art, and drama in the centuries that followed. As the sun set over Alexandria on that August evening in 30 BCE, it marked not only the end of Cleopatra's remarkable life, but also the conclusion of an era in human history. The world she left behind was fundamentally different from the one she had inherited, shaped by the political and cultural changes she had helped to create. Her legacy would endure long after the immediate political consequences of her defeat had been forgotten, inspiring future generations with the example of a ruler who had combined intelligence, courage, and determination in service of her people and her ideals. The gentle waves that lapped against Alexandria's harbor that night carried with them the memory of a queen who had lived and died as a true pharaoh, worthy of the ancient throne she had occupied with such distinction. In death, as in life, Cleopatra VII remained the last and perhaps the greatest of Egypt's royal line, a woman whose story would be told and retold for centuries to come, inspiring wonder and admiration in all who heard it. Epilogue: The Eternal Queen. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Alexandria's streets lay empty and the Mediterranean whispered against the ancient harbour walls, the spirit of Cleopatra seemed to linger in the city she had loved and ruled so well. Though her physical presence was gone, the changes she had wrought in Egypt and the wider world continued to ripple outward like circles in still water, touching lives and shaping events far beyond the borders of her kingdom. The Egypt that Rome inherited in 30 BCE was far more prosperous and sophisticated than the troubled realm Cleopatra had received nearly 2 decades earlier. Her administrative reforms, agricultural improvements, and commercial innovations had created a foundation of stability and productivity that would serve the province well under Roman governance. The libraries, schools, and cultural institutions she had supported continued to flourish, preserving and transmitting the knowledge that would eventually help spark the Renaissance more than 1,000 years later. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, recognized the value of what Cleopatra had built. Rather than dismantling her achievements out of spite or political calculation, he largely preserved the administrative systems and economic policies that had made Egypt so valuable to Rome. The grain shipments that fed the capital, the luxury goods that adorned Roman homes, and the commercial networks that connected the empire to distant markets all bore the imprint of the last queen's wisdom and foresight. The fate of Cleopatra's children reflected both the tragedy of her defeat and the enduring influence of her bloodline. Caesarion, whose claim to Julius Caesar's legacy had posed such a threat to Augustus, disappeared from history in circumstances that remain mysterious but were probably fatal. The twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene were taken to Rome, where they were raised in Augustus's household with the care appropriate to their royal birth, but also the watchfulness appropriate to potential threats. Cleopatra Selene eventually married Juba II of Mauritania, becoming queen of a kingdom that encompassed much of modern-day Morocco and Algeria. Her reign there was marked by prosperity and cultural achievement that clearly reflected her mother's influence and training. Through her descendants, the bloodline of the Ptolemies continued for several more generations, carrying forward the genetic and cultural legacy of Egypt's last pharaoh. The stories told about Cleopatra began to evolve almost immediately after her death, as historians, poets, and popular storytellers added their own interpretations to the basic facts of her life. Roman writers, influenced by the propaganda that had been used against her during the civil wars, often portrayed her as a dangerous seductress whose beauty and cunning had corrupted noble Roman generals. Greek and Egyptian sources were generally more favorable, emphasizing her intelligence, education, and achievements as a ruler. These varying interpretations reflected the complex and often contradictory feelings that Cleopatra's memory evoked in different audiences. For Romans, she represented both the allure and the danger of Eastern luxury and power. For Egyptians, she embodied the last flowering of their ancient independence and the tragedy of foreign conquest. For later generations throughout the Mediterranean world, She became a symbol of female ambition and intelligence, inspiring both admiration and caution. The physical Alexandria that Cleopatra had known gradually changed under Roman rule, though many of her contributions remained visible for centuries. The great library continued to function as a center of learning, though it never again achieved the prominence it had enjoyed during the Ptolemaic period. The palace complex was expanded and modified to serve Roman administrators, but its basic structure preserved the architectural legacy of pharaonic rule. The lighthouse that had guided ships to Alexandria's harbor during Cleopatra's reign continued to serve that function for more than 1,000 years, becoming one of the most recognizable symbols of the ancient world. When earthquakes finally brought it down in the medieval period, its ruins were incorporated into the fortress that still guards the harbor today, a tangible connection between ancient and modern Alexandria. The cultural influence of Cleopatra's reign extended far beyond the borders of Egypt and the lifespan of the Roman Empire. The fusion of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman traditions that had characterized her court provided a model for cultural synthesis that influenced artistic and intellectual development throughout the Mediterranean world. The preservation of ancient knowledge in Egyptian libraries and schools helped maintain the continuity of learning through the political upheavals that followed. Medieval writers and artists found in Cleopatra's story a rich source of inspiration for tales of love, power, and tragedy. She appeared in manuscripts and murals throughout Europe and the Middle East, often portrayed with the clothing and customs of the contemporary period, but maintaining her identity as the legendary Queen of Egypt. These depictions helped keep her memory alive during centuries when classical learning was often neglected or forgotten. The Renaissance brought renewed scholarly interest in ancient history and a more sophisticated understanding of Cleopatra's actual achievements. Humanist writers praised her learning and intelligence, while Romantic poets celebrated her passionate nature and tragic fate. Artists from Michelangelo to Tiepolo created masterworks inspired by scenes from her life, ensuring that her image would be preserved in some of history's greatest art. The Age of Exploration added new dimensions to Cleopatra's legend as European travelers rediscovered Egypt and began to decode the hieroglyphic inscriptions that had preserved ancient Egyptian history. Archaeological discoveries revealed the magnificent monuments and artifacts of pharaonic civilization, providing physical evidence of the cultural achievements that had culminated in Cleopatra's reign. Modern scholarship has continued to refine our understanding of Cleopatra's life and times, using archaeological evidence, papyrus documents, and careful analysis of ancient sources to separate historical fact from legendary embellishment. This research has generally confirmed the ancient sources that portrayed her as an exceptionally capable ruler whose achievements went far beyond the romantic entanglements that dominated popular accounts of her story. Contemporary historians emphasize Cleopatra's role as a successful administrator, a patron of learning and culture, and a skilled diplomat who preserved Egypt's independence longer than any other Hellenistic kingdom. Her multilingual abilities, her understanding of diverse cultural traditions, and her capacity for strategic thinking are now recognized as the true foundations of her historical significance. The lasting appeal of Cleopatra's story reflects its embodiment of universal themes that continue to resonate with audiences across cultures and centuries. Her rise to power demonstrates the possibilities that intelligence and determination can create even in adverse circumstances. Her partnership with Caesar and Antony illustrates both the potential and the dangers of personal relationships in political contexts. Her tragic end reminds us that even the most capable leaders are subject to forces beyond their control. Perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra's life provides an example of how individual excellence can transcend the limitations of time and circumstance. Though she lived more than 2,000 years ago, in a world very different from our own, her combination of intelligence, courage, and dignity continues to inspire admiration and respect. Her story reminds us that the human capacity for achievement, creativity, and nobility of character is not bound by the particular conditions of any historical period. As dawn breaks over modern Alexandria, where traffic moves along streets that may follow routes Cleopatra once traveled, her legacy remains visible in the continuing vitality of Egyptian civilization and the enduring appeal of the ancient world's most fascinating monarch. The last queen of Egypt achieved in death what she had sought in life, a form of immortality that transcends the rise and fall of kingdoms and ensures that her name will be remembered as long as humans tell stories of courage, intelligence, and the eternal struggle between love and duty, ambition and sacrifice. In the gentle rhythm of waves against the Mediterranean shore, in the whisper of desert winds across ancient monuments, in the dreams of those who still find inspiration in stories of remarkable achievement against overwhelming odds, the spirit of Cleopatra VII Philopator continues its eternal reign, proving that some victories are won not on battlefields, but in the human heart, where courage and wisdom can indeed prove mightier than armies and navies, and where the memory of greatness can outlive the mightiest empires. Thus ends our journey through the life of history's most remarkable queen, a woman whose story continues to captivate and inspire us more than 2 millennia after her death. May her example of intelligence, courage, and dignity accompany you into peaceful dreams of ancient splendor and timeless achievement. The end. Thank you for joining the sleepy historian on this journey through ancient Alexandria and the extraordinary life of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the golden light of the ancient world and the eternal wisdom of one of history's most remarkable rulers.